these are, hold on. Merhaba. Why is it safe driving mode? Hello. Oh, video. Okay, you can see me now, yeah? Yeah, so I think there's these mathematical models of things. So we're talking about people giving certain types of mathematical models. You asked about, what did you say about descriptive models? So I actually think that if a lot of this stuff is right, then maybe in psychology, sometimes you won't be able to find mathematical models, but you will be able to find, tell historical stories. Yeah. So I think that, yeah, there are sort of non-quantitative explanations as well. Yeah, and I think that when you're looking at things that are historical, I think sometimes the mathematical models to explain the current working of something that has a history, it may not be possible to. So one sort of, like we have these artificial neural networks, and we can train this artificial neural network how to succeed in a task, and we can be explicit about the learning algorithm and everything. So in some sense, we understand how to do it. And then we say, well, that a human being is able to succeed in a similar task, and that how they did this is analogous to how this artificial neural network does it. It seems to me that those sort of explanations are sort of explanations that are, what sort of explanation is that? That's sort of analogy, you've got some sort of analogy, we've got proof in principle about how a system that's a bit like ours can solve a task a bit like this. So I think that, yeah. Okay, so this paper is, I think, quite important, and I would really recommend reading it. I think it's really, especially if you're in psychology, I think it's, some of the stuff is quite important. For those of you kind of interested in the more technical side of things, there's also this guy, he quotes, who has some nice papers. Yarkoni. And Yarkoni has a paper that is about choosing prediction over explanation in psychology. And Yarkoni has a bunch of interesting articles that fit in with this. There's a nice blog. There's a nice what's it called? Podcast. What is it? Brains, etc. Does anyone know that podcast? Yeah, I'll in the break I'll have a look. I can't look on my phone now, but that's a sort of comp sci podcast. Yeah, brain inspired. Yeah. Is it brain or brains? Yeah. Brain inspired. Yeah. If anyone likes listening to podcasts, have you ever listened to anything? He just does interviews with kind of fairly big names, and he has a nice interview. He has a nice kind of 2-hour-long discussion with someone who's into this prediction and explanation stuff. And so the sort of idea here is that we've got these systems we don't understand, yeah, and like a human being, and then we want to understand how it does what it does, and how it succeeds in some task. So we want to come up with a model of how the human being sort of does what it does in the world. And I take it that, so we've got the kind of scientist, person, and the world. Yep. And I take it that often in psychology, the sort of idea is, well, the person here has a kind of model of the world, creates some internal sort of model of the world. Yeah, so we've got some structure in the world, we've got some structure somehow inside, something, some sort of, and then the scientist, in some sense, then tries to give a model of the model, or the model of the way in which the model is produced. So I think very often that it's thought that what goes on in various tasks is that the person has something like a generative model. Yeah, so we've got something going on. Yeah, and then what we come up with is with a sort of a model of what causes the data that appears to us. Yeah, so we've got a set of data, and then we kind of come up with a sort of hypothesis or something like that about what generated the data. Yeah, and then we might think that the scientist is then interested in terms of what sort of model is being produced and how we produce the model. I take it this sort of stuff about and so with the sort of psychologists think what they're doing is discovering something about the perceiver's model of the world, or of the organism's model of the world. And I take it that the sort of idea is that if this sort of stuff is right, yeah, so we've got an account of how artificial neural networks work that he's going to explain. If this account of how artificial neural networks is right, I think it is, and that we solve tasks in a way similar to artificial neural networks, which seems quite plausible, then in some sense, there is no model, but in some sense, all you're really seeing, when you see something neat and orderly, all you're really seeing is the order in the data. Yeah? Insofar as the data is rule governed, then what's going to be produced is something that looks like it's sort of rule governed, looks like it's a product of a generative model, at least within certain constraints. But instead, all you're really doing is learning something about the data set. But this is the idea now, and so let's think about how some of these models work. So let's say you're a scientist and you want to see how good a system is at doing something. So you might kind of choose, okay, you wouldn't believe that my dad is an artist. Yeah. But did anyone read this paper? No, it's midterms. Okay, so this is quite a difficult paper, and I'm not a mathematician. Yeah, so bear with me. But I'm trying to persuade you to go and read the paper itself. But I think the take home from this paper is really important. And he's got this other paper about the generalizability crisis, which is, I think, if this is right, we might think that the problems in psychology that are labeled as problems of replication are really problems of generalizability. Problems might be a lot deeper. Okay, so here's a sine wave. So you have a sine wave, and then what you might do is you basically produce a set of data points . You produce a set of data points, yeah, that you kind of take this line and then you add in some noise to produce a set of data points. And then you give this, you have a kind of learning period. You show the system this data, and then what you've got here is something where you've just got the X and Y axis. What you do is you train it up on a set of points, and then you ask kind of for a bunch of X values that the system hasn't seen to give a Y value. Yeah, and what you hope is that that if it's doing well, you're going to think it for every X point, it's going to give a kind of Y point that's roughly on the curve. Yeah, so you've got, now, how do you do this? Well, the scientists who've created the data set have got a sort of generative model. They've taken a sine function and they've used that to generate a set of data. And ideally, what the kind of perceiver does is to look at the set of data, and then after some time, be like, oh, it's a sine function, it's that sine function. Yeah, or it's roughly that sine function. Yeah, so you might think that to solve this problem, that ideally, what you do is you work out the function that is behind the data. Now, in statistics, so this is on page 419 of the, does anyone have access to the article? This is 344 of the bulk pack, I think, but maybe the numbers are a bit off. It looks like this. Yeah. So when you've got a set of data, there's various so there's your underfit, ideal fit, and overfit. Yeah, this is yeah, so you've got this data. You wouldn't really find that as an object. Yeah, okay. Let's suppose that's a sine wave. Right? There's an underlying sine wave there. You might think, well, you know, one sort of thing, you might just be very simple and everything you see is a straight line. Yeah, so the only sort of model thing, you might say, oh, I fitted the data. Yeah, and you might think, well, a straight line in this case, if you've got something produced by sine wave, a straight line is just going to miss a lot of the shit. Yeah, you haven't got enough curves in the straight line. You haven't got enough sort of wiggly bits. Yeah, and so this just has a straight line just has the equation that produces a straight line just has two parameters. Yeah, it's what is it? It's y equals a plus dx. Is that right? Okay, is that a straight line? Something like that. Yeah. And like these are the parameters. Yeah. So but you have equations with more parameters, and it can kind of wiggle around more, do more sorts of yeah. So like here's the x-axis. So this is going to be like, suppose this is 1, 2, I don't know. Yeah, so when x is 0, y equals a. Yeah. So and then this gives you the kind of slope. Yeah. 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 So if you've got a line, it crosses the y-axis at a certain point. That's what this basically tells you, and then it has a certain slope. They're the two degrees of freedom you have with a straight line. Yeah, so these parameters are like degrees of freedom, things you can move around. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but for a straight line, shouldn't that?
Oh no, sorry, it's supposed to be a sloping line. Yeah, so sorry, I mean, so this. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. But I didn't mean I mean, yeah. I mean, the simplest way would be just one parameter where you say y equals a, and so for any x, you know, it's easy. Yeah. If you want anything with where x plays a role, you have two parameters, yeah, which is basically kind of where the line hits the x-axis, y-axis, and what its slope is. Yeah. So this is sort of underfit. Yeah. If you've got a complex set of data, just putting a straight line on it I don't know, unless if you're doing an undergrad psychology project, maybe that's what you do. But then it's like, well, look at this data, and you're going to say, oh, actually, kind of, what I want is a kind of slope like that. That's going to be, that looks like that sort of fits the data, sort of slope like that. And now, how many parameters? I'm not sure about. I mean, does that have 3 parameters? This equation that produces that has more. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, and I was good at maths at high school, and then just haven't really done much of it. So I get how this stuff works, but like the actual equations.
Is it
Yeah.
like a sinus function?
What? Maybe this is a sine function. Yeah. Maybe I want a sine function because it doesn't really matter. Like that's going to be a good thing. Yeah. And then you might have other functions. It may turn out it's not a sine function, it's like the off sine function. Yeah. But that's a quite good fit. So that's going to be something like ideal fit. And then you can have overfit. So in overfit, you have too many. In an overfit, you have too many diversions. So you might think that you could just go through every point and have a curve that goes like this. Yeah. So you can have an equation that kind of produces something like, well, not all of them, but you know, and this is going to be a mess. Yeah. So this is kind of an overfit. And one of the things I think they warn you in psychology is when you've got your models of overfitting the data. Yeah. Is this something you've heard about, overfitting the data? Yeah. So this is taken to be a worry. Now, how machine learning does this shit, isn't by how these artificial networks do this, solve these problems, isn't by isn't by having an ideal fit. So the ideal fit involves kind of guessing what the function is. Yeah. So but basically for ideal fit, you solve the problem by trying to guess what the function is that produced the data set you're given. Yeah. So you're trying to solve. You're trying to predict the data. You're trying to model the data. You're trying to come up with some equations. But with ideal fit, what you're trying to do is you're trying to guess the function, the equation that sort of produce the data set that you've been given. And when you're training these things, when you're doing these sort of tests, you choose the function. The experimenter can choose the function, and then what they can do is add some noise in, add some kind of a little bit of randomness on top of it. Yeah. How artificial neural networks do this is by direct fit. And direct fit involves, I think, 2 things. First of all, that you have a massive number of parameters. Yeah, so it's not that you just have 100. Yeah, you can have millions of parameters. Yeah, and secondly, you have what's known as regularization. Now, regularization, I think this is something that's a big thing. And we can get in kind of fiddling around with this regularization. But regularization is a way of avoiding too much bumpiness. Yeah, that you might just for every little area, you just choose a local average. Yeah, so you might just have a little sampling in a mini area and just choose an average in that area. Yeah, but what regularization does is sort of with overfit, you have a real problem. Oops. And with regularization, you end up pretty successfully. Well, what do you end up being able to do? Well, what you end up being able to do is to very reliably predict new cases within the bounds that you've been given. Yeah, so the direct fit allows you to predict very well and predict very well how, and here I need some spelling, in the interpolation zone. Now this is something everyone's like, well, I thought he was going to say something that made sense. Yeah. Direct fit allows you to predict very well in the interpolation zone. So, what? Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, so the thing about overfit, if you've got a model that overfits the data, it's very bad at making predictions. Because you say a point here and it gives you a point up here. Yeah, so models that overfit the data are bad predictively. What direct fit does, you have these two things. You have a massive number of parameters, and then you have some form of regularization. What direct fit does is allows you to make very good predictions within the interpolation zone. Now, later on, we're going to talk about facial recognition. But they're talking about matching sine waves to begin with and matching waves. But I'll give you some. I'm going to talk a bit more about the interpolation zone. We're going to look at. I'm going to work through the sort of experiments, the experiments on artificial neural networks you go through. But like the interpolation zone might be something like the sort of the data set on which you've been trained. Yeah. So when you're thinking about faces, if you've just been trained on white faces but not Chinese faces, you might be very good at predicting. You might think here predicting may have to do with, is this the same? Yeah, with faces, you see faces from the front, faces from the side, faces from different angles. Yeah, so when you've got a face class, it may be to name the face. It might be to say, is this picture a picture of the same person as that picture? And you have two pictures from different angles. Yeah. Now, if all you've been trained on is faces from the front, two faces a little bit from a different angle from the front, maybe you're very good at it. Yeah. But if you're shown a face from the side and ask, is this the same person as that? You're just like, whoa, I've got no idea. Yeah. But if you've been trained on Western faces, and then you're given some Chinese faces, you might be very good at Western faces, but you're going to be very bad at Chinese faces. That seems to be the case. Yeah, that you can have these things trained, and their competence depends upon the sort of training set. And the interpolation zone has got to do with whether the thing that you're given that's new is of the same kind with the same range as the stuff you've been trained on. Yeah, so I think when it comes to these mathematical things, I think it's quite easy to say what the interpolation zone is, but it's just going to be within a number range. When it comes to things like faces, I think it's going to be more difficult to say, is this face like the faces you've been trained on? It turns out that, Chinese faces, I mean, if you don't have much interaction with Chinese faces, it is true that all Chinese people look the same. This is just a fact about our facial recognition. If this is right, and I think that with artificial networks they have this problem. That if if the network is just trained on white faces, and then you use it to say, is this guy the guy who robbed the bank? And you do it on a black face. That if the training set hasn't been broad enough, then it's going to be very bad. I think these sort of so it turns out that this creates all sorts of problems. So if you want to be using sort of facial recognition stuff in law enforcement, you'd really better make sure that the data set is really quite broad. Yeah. If you're just trained on male faces, the system might be very good at recognizing male faces or saying, are they the same person, but may not be very good on female faces. This is something that comes out later. Yeah. So but things that models that engage in direct fit sort of Look, I've got some graphs. Here's lots of dots on a blackboard. Here's some lines. Everybody.
Thank you so much.
I realized you couldn't see that. Yeah. So this is how artificial neural networks solve these sort of problems. Yeah. Now, the way they're able to do this is how does a so you've got with a sort of network, you have a bunch of, I mean, I don't know, you've got all of these. You've got all of these kind of, who knows how a neural network works? Anyone? Yeah, a little bit. I mean, you get some sort of input cells. Yeah, so let's say this might be, you've got a photo in front of this pixel, and then you've got a bunch of cells in the middle. And depending on what happens here, stuff happens here. Yeah, and how what happens here affects what happens here. You have sort of weights here. And in the learning process, everything is reweighted. You have a sort of input, and then there's a cascade of effects, and then there's some sort of output. And let's suppose that, this is yes. So you might just build something to be a unit detector, and all it does is tells you is this unit or not. Then you show lots of stuff, and if this fires, the system is saying yes, it's units. Yeah? And basically, what you do is you show lots of photos, and every time it gets it wrong, you say no, you got it wrong. Change your weighting a bit. And you just carry on doing this until until the system is 95% successful or something. So at some point it will be you'll show a picture of a chair and it will say not Eunice, you'll show it a picture of, yeah, so what the learning algorithm does is just set the ways in which what happens in one cell, how that affects what happens in other nodes. Yeah, and that effect can either be excitatory, it can either give a kind of yes signal, or it can be a no signal. Yeah, it can. Yeah. So this is basically sort of how a network works. So you have a very complex set of nodes, all linked to each other. You might have something at the end. You might think of as a kind of yes. It's much more complicated than that. You might think this goes to some sort of motor system. It's all going to be continuous. But what you basically have is you have a training period with a learning algorithm. And there are two types of systems. There's a sort of supervised learning and unsupervised learning. So supervised learning is when you have someone from outside telling the system whether they got it right or not. Yeah, so that you've got a data set, a bunch of pictures. These pictures have been looked at by a bunch of students, who've been paid 2p a picture, and they tell you, when you're doing the what's it called, the chapter. Is there a car in this picture? yeah. But basically, and then the learning algorithm is just a way of updating when you get things wrong. Yeah? And there's various sort of learning algorithms. And these systems are quite good at pattern recognition and this. And what you may think is that in terms of statistics, all machine learning is doing is just very complicated statistics. So I think machine learning is just another way for statistics, posh statistics. Yeah. But what they're producing is sort of mathematically are just, you might think of it kind of functions with millions of parameters. That they go into this massive overfit. And what they have is they have this sort of they have some sort of regularization. And the regularization stuff. Now, let's have a look at the experiment. So if you've got a system like an artificial neural network that is doing this sort of direct fit stuff, what sort of stuff can it do and what can't it do? Yeah, so first of all, we just introduced this idea of these three different types of fit. Now, what time is it now? Okay, so this is on page this is on page 420. And this does, you might think, oh, this is supposed to be a philosophy class, what does this have to do with philosophy? But I think this is quite important in terms of, it's sort of for philosophy of science, for thinking about how minds work, maybe, if this is right. What is intelligence? This sort of direct fit is just brute, stupid fitting. It's one of the things he stresses is how this is just a kind of, and in fact, it manages to fit in the same way that evolution manages to fit. So in evolution, you've got an environment and you've got organisms that are trying to fit in their environment. And through massive experimentation, yeah, the organisms get adapted to their environment. And how these sort of networks work is kind of similar to the success of organisms in adapting and fitting their niche within an environment. Also, it's very stupid brute force. Yeah. If you try enough times with a bit of variation, yeah, you'll find something that works. Yeah, that's basically. And if the environment is relatively stable, then the thing you find to work will last. You might think that's what learning is. So this sort of view of learning, it's just like you try lots and lots of times, trying all sorts of stuff in, like when I get a stimulus like this, I do something like this and see what happens. If you do that enough times, you find ways of doing stuff that sort of works. The ways, I'm looking at Alijan at the moment, like the first couple of weeks, now he's like, yeah, you know, like you manage to go and grab things and put them in your mouth. But you start off just by waving your arms around madly, yeah, and then slowly over time, you have some of them, you know, your thumb ends up somewhere near your mouth, and after some time, you learn how to, yeah, how to get it to work. So on page 42, okay, so there are these three pictures. Do people have them? Yeah. Okay. So in the book, they're not in my blog pack. They're not. The colours aren't there. So tell me if I make any mistakes. Because I'm doing this in black and white. Don't try it at home. Do it in colour. Yeah. Yeah. So they. So first experiment. First experiment is sort of. You should get the first experiment from what I told you before about the sine function. Yeah. This is you have a function that was used to generate a set of data. You've got the x-axis, you've got the y-axis. Let's say this is, what was it? Between -5, 0, 5. So they produced a bunch of data. The training set was between values of 0 and 5. Then they gave, once they trained up the network on this big data set, then they gave a bunch of X values that the system hadn't come across before. And within this range, the system was always thinking, why do we need 3 different colors of blackboard markings? Never, okay, yeah, within this range, the system was very good at making predictions. But you gave it a you gave it a sort of X value that it hadn't been trained on, and it was just sort of useless. Yeah, it couldn't fit the curve. Yeah, so you can train up a system like that. In here, the interpolation zone is very clear. It's between a certain range of X values, the X values on which the system's being trained up. So I think here we've got and they call this the interpolation zone. Yep. Here. This is the extrapolation zone. Now, if the system worked by taking the data, creating some sort of generative model, and kind of trying to work out the underlying function, then, you know, it would take the data and think, oh, it's a sort of sine function, and then do just as well out here as it does in here. Yep. But that's not how these systems work. Yeah, that within the interpolation zone, they're very good at making predictions. You move outside. Yeah. So yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm going to connect to Gibson because it's the most recent
Yeah.
designer. Is this like the similar difference between invariance versus constancies? Because constancies is about the particular example of things, whereas the invariants are just about the structure. Here it fails to grasp the structure, but grasps the particular thing that it just belongs over and over.
So these guys think that this goes together with the sort of Gibsonian approach. So they think that Gibson gives us a sort of direct fit, because what you want to do is you want to pick up on the sort of invariance out there, and that these systems are good at doing that, at least within the zone of, yeah.
Because the invariant thing is the function of what it fails to grasp it.
Yeah, well, but I mean,
whereas the constant is about the constancy of a size of I don't know, bottle, for example, or just like in certain cases, because constancy is like I see the space from this angle at this particular time, and that is actually thinking that is actually about the structure, whereas it's just about the particular perspective you are taking at the moment.
Yeah, so this is what he says about Gibson. Yeah, so he says, according to Gibson, the brain does not aim to reconstruct the world from noisy fractal images, but rather directly detects the relevant information needed for action from a rich array of input. The School of Ecological Psychology did a tremendous work in showing how rich the visual input, and they focused on the input, and how actions guided the selection of relevant information. The ecological psychology school's critique of the traditional, strongly representational computational approach evokes resentment and skepticism in the field. So, which took the position that without workable computational models, the argument in favor of direct perception seems vague and unscientific. Direct fit is an algorithm, and a strange twist of history. This is on page 428. In a strange twist of history, advantages in artificial neural networks and the idea of direct fit provide the missing computational framework needed for the ecological school of thought. Direct fit is an algorithmic procedure to minimize an objective function, allows neural networks to learn the transformation of external input to meaningful action without the need to explicitly represent underlying rules and principles in a human interpretable way. Yeah, so these systems are good at going from input to the appropriate action. They're able to pick up on the affordances. And if the information is out there in the environment, these systems are able to kind of find it, respond to it appropriately. They're just good by using brute force of finding structure in the environment. Yeah, if it's a sort of within the environment that they've been exposed to. Yeah, you put these systems in a new environment, and they don't know what to do. Yeah, yeah. So I think they're right that this kind of allows a way of understanding how Smithsonian stuff works. That you're basically, and has anyone taken the class with Emre? Emre Orr? Oh. He's now chair of the psychology program. Emre Orr. He's in computer engineering, and he sort of works on Gibsonian robotics. If anyone's interested, go and find Emre and ask about Gibsonian robotics. What time is it now? Okay, so shall I tell you about Emre's work? Anyone interested in Gibsonian robotics? So yeah, so Emre, because I think this is sort of relevant. So Emre's got these robots. They're pretty rubbish. When you see a robot, you think these bosses. I know these robots are pretty rubbish. Yeah. But Emre's got some robots. And so one sort of task, this is kind of quite cute. So you've got an environment. Let's think the environment is a tabletop. And on the environment, you've got three types of objects. You've got spheres, you've got cylinders, and you've got cubes or rectangles. Yeah, and these cylinders have different qualities. A sphere, if you bump into it, what happens? It just rolls out of the way. So this is not an obstacle. You've got cylinders, and a cylinder, if you approach it from this end, it's an obstacle. If you approach it from this side, it's not an obstacle. It just rolls away. And then you have a cube, which is an obstacle from any direction. So you get these little robots, and they kind of go around on the tabletop, and they get some image, yeah, and then they've got to decide, and they get an image of what's in front of them, and then they've got to transform that image into a motor action. Yeah, so let's suppose there are, I don't know, 5 different directions it can go. Yeah, so yeah, each of these directions is given a number, say between 0 and 1, based upon the image. Yeah, and then it will move in the direction that has the highest value, something like that. And basically, what you have is you have some sort of learning algorithm that gets you from the image to an output. And if the way the system is set up, if it leads to a movement in which the system is blocked, yeah, then something is gone wrong. So it kind of rejigs all its internal way. Yeah, until at time it's able to navigate the environment without running into obstacles. Yeah, it's able to avoid obstacles in the environment, and it does it in such a way that you know, if you're thinking classically about how to do this, you think, well, first of all, you have to look at features of the environment. You have to kind of categorize these things. You have to do edge detection of line curves and the like. But this system doesn't do any of that. It doesn't start, and it has all of these internal weights I mean, I think, oh, maybe one of these weights represents if something's curved or not. It's really not obvious that any weights do this. Yeah, but so this sort of AI manages to transform visual input into motor action in this sort of way and it's sort of picking up on the information out there in the image. Now, of course, it's not fully Gibsonian. And I'm not sure if he just looks at static images or whether he looks at pairs of images and you get the vector stuff. I can't remember the details of it. Yeah, yeah, basically that you're learning how to translate sort of input into action. Yeah, and you're picking up on information that's out there as a way to successfully guide action, without necessarily coming up with any sort of generative model of the environment. There's no generative model of the environment. And then he tries to do more complex things. So then he has these robots that try and pick things up and stack them. So you're learning about other types of audiences, about which sort of things are stackable on other things. Quite a difficult thing. But that's yeah, and so I think these systems can just pick up on information out there and yeah.
I think there's commonality between these kind of systems and in Gibsonian approach. But I mean, like in Gibson, invariants are like more abstract than this kind of root. I mean, yes, they both emphasize the importance of environment. They rely on it. But again, I mean, I think these systems have nothing to do with invariance, per se.
Well, but they're picking up on structure, and it might be quite high level structure. So suppose you've got a robot like this, and then you want to ask yourself, how does it work? Well, I told you how it works, but then you might say, well, but I don't know how. I think at one level, the sort of question is well, what sorts of structure in the information is this system picking up on? That becomes kind of, once you've understood how it's been trained, you understand perfectly well what the learning algorithm is, the sort of data it's getting in. But then the sort of question is, what sort of features out there in the environment of features it's picking up on? And that's, yeah.
But in Gibson, like the texture itself is not a different structure, but it's, for example, as something that is accompanying your perception of other things. Here it seems like they're all discrete and there's like excess of noise. Whereas in Gibson, they are like they're interconnected. For example, it's kind of like a certain reflection comes with a certain degree of dimensionality and like texture, and you do not see the textures, I don't know, function before then extrapolate from it itself, but you see the light, and the light gives you that information at that time. Whereas what you do here is that encode all of them separately. Then they don't accompany one another.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I think I can see how a system like this, in principle, could learn to pick up on and react appropriately to the sort of information that Gibson points us to. So Gibson says, like, if we're doing psychology, the first thing we should look at is the sort of structure of the environment. And then we look at the structure of information in the media that's potentially available to organisms. So there's going to be light, there's going to be noise, there's smell, yeah. But what sort of, and then think about the sort of information in that. So we start off by looking at the structure of the information. Yeah, and then the question is how, and then the sort of thought is that we've evolved to be able to pick up on this type of information. And then you think, well, yeah, you can see how an artificial neural network could learn to pick up on information like that. Yeah, because it's basically exploring. It's got to do something, and it's sort of It's suppose the only way of doing something successfully is picking up on this information, this type of information. You might think that the system starts off by responding to all sorts of things, none of it works, and then one time you sort of get lucky, and it's like, oh, and then it starts getting better and better and picking up just on this type of information out there in the environment. So I think these systems learn. So of course here, the task is just you're given an X value, and then you're supposed to give it a Y value. But actually in sort of more realistic systems, then the output isn't going to be just a value, it's going to be continuous behavior. That what you're going to be doing is acting appropriately in your environment. Yeah, you're going to be not falling off of edges, you're going to be, that's, yep.
I think, as far as I know, there are some parallels between biological visual system and the artificial. But it's really limited. So these artificial networks also start picking up smaller, as we call it, receptive fields, but not in the sense of actually receptive fields, but like they affect the error function, they correct the error function more and more as they go with the deeper into the layer.
Okay.
Our visual about also their fields are actually encoding this picture.
I mean,
It seems to me that when you come up with a model, you start applying.
yeah. So one thing is that of course biological systems are not neural networks like this. Not that they're not. You've got artificial neural networks. Biological systems are a lot more complicated. In these systems, you've got switches, we've got oscillators, we've got around, the brain, you've got a whole bunch of chemical processes going on that are modulating. Yeah, so it's not just the neurons doing the work. You've got different concentrations of different neurotransmitters. We don't, the brain is a lot more complicated. But I take it the sort of thought is that there are certain, so psychologists are thinking that for certain tasks, the way it's being solved is that what we're doing is coming up with a generative model. Yeah, and I think if you think that to solve a certain task, that humans are kind of in some sense coming up with a generative model. Yeah, and some psychologists, that's what you're then trying to look for. You're trying to think, well, what is the generative? What sort of how do we come up with the generative model we have of the world? I take it this sort of approach says that well, there's a whole way of doing. There's a way of doing a whole bunch of shit that doesn't involve generative models. Yeah. And after the break, I want to come back and look at 2 other examples, and then I want to talk about some of the consequences of this for psychology, because you might think that so what these systems are good at, they're good at predicting within the sort of environment they're used to. But these sort of systems are very bad at extrapolating. So there's a certain type of generalization that they're not very capable of doing. You learn something, and then as long as you're within this within the comfort zone, you're okay. And the sort of worry, because it kind of here's why I think this is relevant for psychology. The sort of worry is that in a lab experiment, you're giving the people you've got a very controlled experimental environment. Yeah. Now, of course, if you've got a system that is coming up with a generative model, that doesn't matter. What you're interested in is how the generative. But if you've got something that's overfitted, then the interpolation zone is going to be the kind of constrained lab data. Yeah. What happens outside the lab when you get a different set of data? It might go completely haywire. And actually, within a lab, you can give a nice fitted data. Actually, in reality, so one thing is about when we look at the environment, how clean is the environment? How clean is the structure of the environment? Is it all nice and linear? And the answer probably is, well, there's a lot of non-linearity in the environment. So you can produce a function that kind of goes like this. can have a function that goes like this. Yeah, and it might be that if you're trained up on this bit of the function, yeah, you're going to produce something that looks like a sine wave. But if you're trained on all of this, so these, and this is example number 3. That they train. You can train a neural network on a function like this that you can generate through something like random walk. They generate a function that's sort of a fairly random function, has bits of uniformity within it, and these systems are good. Once they've been given a training set, then they're really good at predicting where new stuff is on this. But if you just train something on this in a lab, they're going to produce something like this. And the one thought is, well, this is where the replication crisis is, because the data in the world is more like this. In the lab, you give a very constrained, organized data kind of clean environment. Yeah, and in some sense, this is why you're not able to replicate, because even slight changes in the lab, you're in a completely different type of data set. And so the problem isn't with your statistics, it's just a general problem of the structure of the information in the environment. If the information in the environment that are used by us to solve tasks is sort of messy and complex, and we're solving it through something more like direct fit, then what we're going to expect is failure of replication of any experiment. Not because of a problem with the statistical stuff, but just because these experiments are assuming a sort of uniformity that isn't there. Okay, so let's have a break. And then after the break, I think I've told you most of the stuff in this paper. I think it's a really fun paper. I think it's definitely worth reading. And I think if you're in psychology, I think it sort of raises questions, and interesting questions. If you're in linguistics, so one difference between artificial neural networks and us is artificial neural networks need huge amounts of data. So, you have these artificial neural networks that can get very good at playing video games, but they need to play, 10,000 times. You give a video game to a 10-year-old kid, and within a day, they'll be like, whoa, yeah. So we're able to succeed on some of these tasks very quickly. So one question is, and with language, for example, that there are still debates about the poverty of the stimulus. So with these artificial neural networks learning to do stuff in linguistics, they're given a huge corpus. It looks like if we can solve a task with a very small amount of information, then it looks like this isn't how we're doing it. Yeah, but if the way we can solve problems is through huge data, then this is, and I think like looking at Amjad, I think the sort of fine motor control does seem, all he's doing all day is looking at his hands and moving his hands, and yeah, the amount of the data the amount of the training he's going through is, I think, huge. You have a question? Okay. What time is it now?
12 starts.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it's right to be suspicious. It's like, is this really Gibsonian? I think what it is though is that I think it offers a story about how a story in principle about how a biological system can pick up on the sort of the sort of structure that Gibson interested in.
Like, I don't know, most things start to feel same. Most models or most theories start to feel same, and it's all like, this is what we know. Let's try to predict what is outside of by this model, which was suited mostly for this example, and then let's connect it to something else, and let's also bring technology inside and try to have this reverse arrow from technology to biology, which I think is kind of a mistake. I mean, I will understand that imitating biological systems onto technology, but I don't understand how making that, because we are able to construct such a technological device, that it is actually showing us what a biological system is doing.
Well, but like, I think what you've got here though is a proof of principle. The sort of proof of principle is that there are certain things that can be done quite well without having to generate any sort of generative model. Yeah. And I think that within psychology, so maybe you're not worried about this, but within psychology, I think there's lots of ideas. Oh, that if you find a system that gives you a sine wave, something that looks very much like a sine wave back, you're like, oh, what the system has done is learn the sine wave. And that's not necessarily the case. It may just be good at giving stuff back within this, and it's all done through a sort of local interpolation of kind of local averaging. Yeah, so you're given a number like this. You're given a number here. And then you're like, oh, I have a number. Anyway, let's take 5 closest numbers, take the average of them. And you do that for any number you're given. You can just go and look. And of course, they haven't stored all the numbers and then go and look them up. But it's sort of a bit like the way they solve the problem. It's a bit like this is how they're doing it.
I mean, a large part of machine learning literature is already occupied by these non-generative models.
Yeah.
So it's been already known for decades that without generative models we can do a lot of stuff. So I mean, I kind of miss the exact what's exactly going on here in this paper. Although I haven't read it yet.
2020. Why? Yeah.
Like maybe it was like the 90s. Like,
No. This is quite new. I think like there's him, there's Nakuni, there's this whole kind of people into this kind of prediction versus explanation stuff. And I think, yeah, within machine learning, people have known this, but I think within psychology, so I think this is sort of aimed at psychologists. Like, I think like within psychology, there's lessons to be learned, I think, about, and within neuroscience.
I think we should dismiss psychology altogether and we just synthetic biology, see whether it can be human beings or not.
anyway, you're learning to interview words.
We're just talking about statistical models of language models this morning.
Who was?
Language models, like instead of like throw the generative static models to the trash and continue with the statistical models, probability models. And the teacher is like very nervous about it. Like I know, I'm also a linguist. I'm a statistician. They're just gonna take all of our jobs. Feels like that.
Yeah. No, I think language is interesting because
There's a nice, I don't know whether it's not, but there's a recent paper in the possibility of studying language in ecological psychology from ecological perspective, and I can share it with the class. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. There was
Why I'm saying this, but it's a recent paper about it. I think that all of this composition of systems, collective stuff, etc., are kind of problematic in this course.
Yeah.
And I don't know how it is problematic.
Yeah. So last year in our reading group, we had these 2 really cool linguists who were coming. I think they're still coming. You're a linguist, yeah? So there's this woman, Ruth Kempson, who was at King's. And then they do these, and then the woman who's taken over from her, she's emeritus now, she's got a Greek woman. And they do this sort of dynamic syntax stuff where it's all kind of done on the fly. So you don't, and I think this is something that also brings in some of this affordance like stuff. Because you start, and one thing about language that they stress is that I can start talking and you can carry on a sentence, and we can have this stuff that goes backwards and forwards, where there isn't any sort of complete represented sentence. We just, in some sense, know how to go on. And so you might think that once you start saying some stuff, that then it's possible that there are constraints on what it's possible to say next. Yeah, and both syntactically and semantically. And so it's sort of it's quite technical. So she worked through their basic model. If you're interested, yeah, Ruth, is it Ruth Gibson? Yeah. Yeah, I think language is, so as I said before, that so the big difference I think between artificial neural networks and possibly us is we don't need so much experience to be able to do stuff. So like there was a paper in BBS a couple of years ago about this, was it there? About how we were able to learn to play computer games very quickly, whereas these artificial systems need many, many trial and error runs. And so I think, yeah, the question in linguistics is so I think the poverty of the stimulus arguments still has something to it, because these artificial neural networks are just getting the whole corpus. Yeah, and they're getting the whole corpus in easily written down text. Yeah, and so we're getting kind of very messy noise signals and learn to speak. Yeah, so it's not. So the question is there's a big argument about how much poverty there is in the stimulus. Yeah, so
I think like people are like dumb teachers who don't just something
okay. Yeah.
They can do language stuff for very efficient and for computers for like if you have a model like GPT-3, a whole bunch of supercomputers working there trying to become remotely close to what humans can do, and it's very energy intensive. 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 Like then how are humans doing very
yeah. So I'm quite sympathetic to the Tomasello sort of approach. So you know Tomasello has got this his earlier stuff is on language acquisition. So he's got this book on what's called constructing a language. And I think like his sort of approach is that semantics is first. So the big problem in language is semantics and sort of the syntax. Once you've got semantics, once you've got some meaning, then getting syntax is quite easy. And I think that's sort of right. So I think that yeah, and then his sort of approach is that to get semantics, you need joint attention, and you need, it's a sort of pragmatic approach. So I think there's something right about that. And I think these models, these things are just going through vast amounts of text and then being able to kind of predict what comes next. Yeah, and produce strings of words that seem appropriate. I'm really getting there. But yeah, so he talks about language, and I think that he yeah, so yeah, he thinks that who's that guy? Is he at Princeton? You know, the guy who just filmed his son for his whole childhood. Do you know this in linguistics? There's one guy who basically he was working. They wanted to find out about the poverty of the stimulus. So how much language is a child exposed to in? I haven't seen a TED talk, but I saw him on a documentary. It was a kind of, maybe it was, there's a documentary I think that was on Netflix called Babies. Have you seen that? I think maybe it was on that. It's quite fun. If you like babies and you like cognitive science, it's sort of, oh, you get both of them. And some of the stuff there is really stupid. Some of it's quite cool. Yeah, you know, and there's some of the usual suspects like Alison Gopnik and this guy from Princeton. He basically, yeah, just filmed his child all the way through, and there was just videos in every room. And then he had a bunch of what do you call them, slaves, graduate students who kind of went through the data, kind of, you know, just basically recorded every word that he'd been exposed to.
It's kind of like movie people from like a man has his father.
Oh yeah.
The man shoots his father through all developments, and the guy gets kind of crazy and becomes like killer.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder what happens to this kid. Yeah.
I mean,
When the kid finds out, it's going to be a bit like the Truman Show. I wonder when he hits his kind of teenage years. Yeah, what's his name? So yeah, he yeah. Yeah, so here's the kind of everything. And like here's the kind of bit of the environment where you're getting your data. And if things are like this, if what you're learning from is in here, then what you have to do is you have to kind of generalize from, so this is extrapolation from limited data. Now, so one way of thinking about learning is this is our situation. And we live in a kind of quite limited environment that we're sampling when we're learning from a small subset of the environment, and then we have to kind of make these generalizations. If that's what the kind of task of learning is, then or if this is how we learn, then the way we do this is to kind of come up with models that are going to work outside of the limited data we're given. With these sort of with this machine learning, you have sort of massive data. So and the thing is that that it's not necessarily saying it's massive. It's not that it's more data point, but it's sort of the goal is that it's getting the data from a sort of broader area of the environment. And if this is what your data set is like, then your form of generalization or your form of prediction for this data could be interpolation. Yeah. And if you're learning in this direct fit way with a kind of data set that a large data set that captures most of the environment that you're going to run into, then you're going to be very good predictively. Because within here, you're going to be very good. Out here, you're going to mess up. So let's hope, you know, like if you haven't seen any Chinese faces, you know, that you're not going to be very good. Yeah. But if the new sample is similar enough or the same kind of stuff you've learned from, then you're going to do quite well. Now, as I said before, like being of the same kind or similar enough, with the sort of experiments they're doing, they can say quite clearly what they mean by this. Yeah, or between -5 and 5. Yeah, that another experiment they did, which I think is quite, so these graphs here, the experiment I showed you here is spatial. They also did a temporal version of this, which I think is a quite cool experiment. Once again, this is an experiment on an artificial neural network. And you ask me, oh, why is this interesting? I take it though that if we're solving a problem, if there's something we do, and the way we're doing it is a bit like this, then we'd expect to see these similar sort of patterns of good prediction within similar cases, and then losing this capacity outside of the similar cases. And so here you have, so this is number B. So you have a sine function. Oops, is this indelible? No, it does not work. Has anyone ever done that? Where you've had the permanent marker and you've written on the board and everyone knows your handwriting. And yeah.
This example it's not about any of these fixed models.
Well, this example here is how ideal fit
So this
is supposed to work, and this way of solving a problem is going to work if the environment is orderly. I'm using the word orderly. If the environment is full of the sort of regularities that are linear, yeah. So in some sense, this is not just about. So this is not so much about processing. It's got to do with different types of environments and different sort of strategies for solving problems. Yeah, if you've got an environment where the sort of structure of data in the environment or the cause of the data in the environment is sort of linear, then something like ideal fit is going to work. Yeah, so if you've got an environment that contains lots of linearities, then this sort of strategy is going to be the best way of living and dealing with that aspect of the environment. If there's things in the environment that are sort of, let's suppose they're rules, and the sort of effects are non-linear, where you've got these sort of, you've got data, you've got, you know, something like the underlying function is going to be more like this, then it's going to turn out that this way of doing things isn't going to be good, because extrapolating from here isn't going to get you anywhere. With an environment like this, you want to be going for something like direct fit, because coming up with the generative model is just going to be, it's going to be sort of intractable. Yeah, so if you've got very non-linear environments, yep. So this is in some other papers in this sort of field, that one way of deciding about how we go about solving a problem isn't to look at what's going on inside our head, but to look at the structure of the environment and to see how much linearity there is in the environment. There are some tasks where extrapolation is just not going to work. Yeah, because you've got non-extrapolable stuff going on. And maybe that's why you said with the Gibsonian stuff about bits of, about things, information about fall-offable edges and including edges, you might think there you do have there are sort of quite strong extrapolation there. But I'm not, yeah, I'm not sure about. Yeah, so this is extrapolation. So this is sort of how ideal fit does it. You look at a kind of limited bit of the environment, and then you extrapolate from there. According to the paper, that the sort of I think according to these guys, this is not how we do it. because and I think the reason for this is that I think they think that they don't say it in this paper, but in some other papers I've read by the same group, that the environment isn't orderly enough for this strategy to work for lots of tasks. Yeah, there aren't simple linearities. Yeah, so this number B, they do the same thing over time. So you have and once again, I'm going to go through this because I think when I first read this, because I don't have a math background, it took me a bit of time to work out what the example was. So I think sometimes just being told makes it a lot easier, and then when you read it yourself. But I do recommend reading this. It's quite fun. I'm just going through the highlights. So experiment C, I think, is really cool because this is a temporal version. So you have a bunch of sine functions. Yeah. Sorry, that's all supposed to be orderly in a sine function. I'm not very good. Yeah, like these ones are more gentle, and these ones are more, and then these ones are more. Yeah, and so the number of hertz tells you how many peaks there are per unit of time. Yeah, and so the training set, yeah, are between, what is it, 2.5 and 4.5. Yeah, and they're given a train. They learn. They get a massive amount of data about that are being produced between 2.5 and 4.5. Yeah, and then they're given a bunch of data. So they've got something like this. Once again. Yeah. And and this is going to be, they weren't given 3 hertz, so they've never seen 3 hertz before, exactly 3 hertz, but they're shown 3 hertz, and then they're given a kind of, it starts like this. How do you carry on? And so this is over time. We're getting a bunch of kind of things happening at time, and then here they sort of carry on pretty much really well. They carry on producing something that sort of looks like a sine wave. If they're given something 2 hertz, yeah, so they're given a sort of, you've got 2 hertz function that you're given a bunch of data, which is this 2 hertz with a bit of noise in it. You ask them how to go on. How does this continue? And they're just like, shit, I've got no idea. Like, yeah, you can look at the pictures here. You know, like, yeah, no, I know. One thing is, like, if you think about Wittgenstein, there are certain things about knowing how to go on. Yeah, so I think the temporal version of this is interesting because one of the things Wittgenstein has in the investigation is the thing about rule following. And how do we know how to go on? How do we know how to follow a rule? And I think here we've got something like a rule. But in some sense, we know how to, this system knows how to go on without representing a rule. It's not like it's not, yeah. And the sort of traditional view is that you might think, well, in order to continue with this task, you have to, in some sense, extract the rule. You have to think what's going on here is this particular type of sine function. And then I've just got to produce something. But actually, this system learns how to go on appropriately without there being any internal representation of the rule. So once again, you're asking about why this might be interesting. I mean, what's relevant about this? I think part of it, especially once you start thinking about the temporal side of things, there's a big literature in philosophy. People, who's a philosopher here? People followed any of the stuff on rule following? People know about this? Oh, okay. So probably the kind of one of the most kind of top, most influential philosophers is Saul Kripke. And he basically was a mathematical genius who basically discovered the semantics or invented the semantics for modal logic. So you have possible world semantics and Kripke models, they're called Kripke models. So he's very big in logic. So he developed the standard models, and then these models can be used for all sorts of other logics as well. So these possible world semantics are really, they're just mathematical objects that can play this role in semantics. But he had a very famous book of naming a necessity, which basically pushes the idea that a sort of direct reference view about naming. This is something we're not going to be talking about Kripke, but when we look at Ruth Milligan, when we start talking about concepts, that her sort of view fits in with a sort of Kripke type view about how names function. Names are not disguised descriptions. Names, pick out objects, and they're. If you're interested, this is one of the most important. Has anyone read this in a Naming a Necessity, like one of the classics? And he also had a set of lectures called Wittgenstein on rules and private language, which I think was in the 80s. And if anyone's interested in Wittgenstein, did you look at this in the Wittgenstein class? People talk about Kripkenstein, because it's Kripke's interpretation of Wittgenstein. But Kripke basically reads Wittgenstein as a sort of skeptic about rule following. So, if you're told 2 + 2 = 4, so 2 + 2 = 4, 2 + 3 = 5. You're learning addition. Yeah. Now, all the evidence for addition, all the data for addition is also evidence for what he calls quaddition. I think that's what he calls it. Quaddition is exactly like addition, except anything above 100 is 0. Yeah. So, quaddition is the same. And the evidence, any evidence you've got that what the function is that people are following is addition is also evidence for quaddition. So once you get new stuff, how do you know to go on? If you're interested, and I think there is a sort of problem here because there are sort of cyclical systems. So when we learn 1, 2, 3, 4, we kind of go, 5, 10, and we've got this idea that you can just carry on. But we have lots of systems where you loop back. So like you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Yeah, so why are the numbers like that? Like, why doesn't it go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 25, 26, 27, 1? It's a sort of fun book. If anyone likes, but I think, so I think one thing is you've got these systems that are able, in some sense, to follow a rule. Within certain context, without necessarily having to represent the rule. So it's a sort of way of, what is it rule following? It's a way of acting in a rule governed way without representing the rules first of all. And I think rules are quite important. So last semester 4, I was teaching a class, grammar seminar on concepts, and one of the books we were reading there, this guy called Yaroslav Peregrine, called Why Rules Matter. Yeah, so he's someone who has this idea that he did a kind of what's known as inferential role semantics. that the meaning of a word or a sentence has got to do with its inferential role, how it relates to other words and sentences and action. Yeah. Theory in what sense?
Theory is like we are understanding concepts based on their causal value and like.
Yeah, so yeah, because theory, we're going to talk about theory next week in theory of mind. But yeah, I think there's a view about concepts that but the way you put it is in terms of causal role. So an earlier version of this sort of inferential role is a causal one. That things have a kind of causal role, and this is how functionalism works in the philosophy of mind. That what it is to be a certain belief is understood in terms of its functional role. Inferential role stuff is different in that it thinks that the sort of content is given by the inferential rules, whereas inferential rules are not causal, they're sort of normative. And I take it these guys influenced by Wittgenstein think of these rules as not causal rules that govern things inside people's heads, but they're sort of normative rules that exist in society. But the source of the normativity is a sort of society. So we can get stuff, we can produce stuff that's grammatically incorrect. So the rules of production tell us these sort of inferential rules are sort of normative. Yeah, and the normativity comes from the society, and a child is taught that if they, if they get stuff wrong, they're sort of corrected. Or okay, so what time is it now? I went on a bit of a what? Okay, so I mean I've talked about so this experiment I think is quite a cool one. So when you read it yourself, I've tried to tell you enough so that you can look at it and be like, okay, I get what's going on here. Number C, I think is important. This is the So the same artificial neural network from A is able to learn an arbitrarily complex function for which there is no ideal model. So you just got some arbitrary function, then you produce a kind of training set on it, give it to the artificial neural network, and then you can give new data that's produced from the same function. Yeah, it's basically learned this arbitrary function. Yeah, so these models, these things do that. And now, in number A, this is important. Yeah, so you could say, one could argue that the artificial neural network has implicitly learned the sign function within the interpolation side. To what degree has the system learned to function? But the critical distinction is that this implicit representation of the sign function is an incidental or emergent byproduct of the structure of the input and the fitting procedure. Yeah, so the fact that it produces a sign function doesn't tell you anything about the system. It just tells you something about the data. Yeah, the fact that you're getting a sign function out is just a fact about the data that's given to the system. It's not a fact about how the system works. Yeah, and that shows like the same system can learn this arbitrary function, and it will be able to, in some sense, reproduce that. And I take it the sort of thought is that this is a worry for psychology, because if you've got a very constrained experimental design set up, yeah, then what you may take to be a feature of the subject who's doing the experiment, maybe all you're really getting back is some abstract features of the experimental design, yeah, the way that you've limited the data. I think this is their view about how certain stuff in neuroscience works, that you have a very limited constrained setup, so the data is very constrained and and then you sort of get some sort of correlations, and then you're like, look, this is how the system works. And it's like, no, the kind of structure you're seeing, all you're really seeing is the structure of the data. You're not learning anything about how the system is processing it. Yeah. So this is. So let me just run through. I've talked about. So you've got these two different systems. The ideal sign function allows us to extrapolate infinite use cases. In contrast, the over-parameterized direct fit model can only be used to predict values of new observations within the confined interpolation zone. Yeah, so one thing is if we're more like this, we're going to expect to see similar breakdowns. When we get data that is not like anything we've come across before, then we're going to behave in weird ways. Yeah. So if you start with a simple model to generate observations, it hopes at recovering the original generative raw from which the training data was sampled. In fact, this is on page 422. When interrogating the over-parameterized model under these conditions, we simply recovered the task dimensions by which we constructed the experimental paradigm or training set. And so you're just getting back what you put into the training set. Yeah. And in contrast to ideal fit models, which flourish in simulations of well-defined experimental settings, direct fit models can provide powerful ways to model big data in which the latent structure is multidimensional, complicated, and prohibitively difficult to model using a handful of factors. So, I mean, this is them talking about this number C. So I'm just making sure I'm going. Okay, so what are we to make about this? That now we might think that these artificial neural networks are obvious. I sometimes say, well, you've created this artificial neural network, you've got no idea how it works. Yeah, because it's just got hundreds, thousands of nodes and parameters. And in some sense, you know that it's, yep. And so what are we to make of this? So black box models that, given the correct input, generate correct output without any explanation of their internal workings. Yeah, and the human face network is comprised of millions of neurons, billions of syntactic weights. So how many parameters do you have? Billions. So you've got a function that has billions of parameters. Yeah, this manages to do the task. In some sense, you might think, well, we have no way of knowing how it works. And when it comes to facial recognition, these artificial neural networks, facial recognition systems, have superhuman abilities. They're better than human beings. And so we know that there are certain tasks which artificial networks can solve better than us. Now, to what degree do we not understand these networks? So this is our optimistic case. We build artificial networks according to explicit architectural specifications. We train networks using explicit learning rules and finite training samples with well-specified objective functions. So they are fully transparent glass boxes. They're not black boxes. We know we have direct access to every weight in the network. Yeah. And given their unprecedented levels of transparency, why do we think of these networks as black boxes, so we don't understand them? And this is their answer. He says, well, we do so because we are deeply committed to the assumption that the artificial neural network must learn a set of human interpreted rules necessary for processing information. This is our classical criterion for understanding. Since we do not readily find such rules when interrogating the distribution of millions of adjustable weights within over-parameterized artificial and biological networks. We demote such models to black box data. So basically, the systems don't work in terms of human interpretable rules. And this is why, like, we've got these models that are able to predict, but we might think explanation appeals to human interpretable rules. So one thing is if it turns out that we're like this, does that mean that in some sense we can't be explained? And we can model what we do, but we can't be understood. And maybe, so I think one thing they're sort of arguing for is this search for understanding how we work in terms of human interpretable rules isn't going to work. And I think this is the sort of pessimistic side of this picture. Yeah, that we come into psychology trying to understand human beings. And understanding involves explaining behavior and capabilities in terms of human interpretable rules. And human interpretable rules explain things in terms of a few parameters, the relationship between a few parameters. So, facial recognition, we might think, well, there's the kind of color of the eyes, the kind of, I don't know, the distance. I mean, yeah, maybe we can say, oh, there's 3 things that we look at, or 7 things. And then, well, with these neural networks, it's like, well, what features are these neural networks attending to? And it's like, well, maybe they're attending to billions of features. Really kind of all these, and some of them have very small weight, but there's all these different features that are being attended to. Yeah, and so the way so like, how do you recognize your wife? You might say, I don't have a wife, so I don't. How do I recognize my wife? Yeah, how do I know it's a baby? Yeah, and you might think, well, what you're asking me is like, what are the features that allow you to re-identify her under a whole bunch of different circumstances? And I think the answer they're going to say is, well, there isn't a set of human interpretable rules that I can give you to answer that question. Like, there's a whole bunch of parameters and then, I take it that, I mean, you may fiddle around and find out that there are certain parameters that maybe we didn't take to be that important that turns out to be more significant. But once again, you're probably going to learn that not by looking inside the head, but by looking at the data. Yeah, but it may turn out that distance between eyes is really important, or distance between nose and eye. Yeah.
Are they saying those rules don't exist, or they are not discoverable, but like are intractable?
I think they're saying that if biological neural networks work like artificial neural networks, then these human interpretable rules don't exist. There aren't any human interpretable rules. And so if a certain type of task is solved in this way, any sort of psychology or neurological kind of explanation that aims to explain the working in terms of human interpretable rules is just going to fail. And maybe that's the reason for the reputation crisis, because they might give you, that, and I take it the sort of thought is that the world is quite messy, and so the interpretable rules might work if you give a very constrained environment where there's only a few variables in play. You get more when you have more things in play, you get lots more non-linearity. I think like lighting conditions. You slightly change the lighting condition, and it may completely change how the system works. Yeah, but if you're in a lab and you've got a particular type of electric light, and you might kind of be in a slightly different lab, and the electricity is slightly different. Yeah, the power is slightly different. And something like that could just, it could turn out to change the behavior. Yeah, so so the sort of idea is that that in a lab setting, you may manage to kind of keep the experiment. You may have a very artificial environment where you keep the number of free parameters very limited. And within that very particular environment, you might be able to have a model for how the system behaves in that environment. But then the problem is that it's one of the things that they're interested in, that this guy Hasson is interested in. He's got another paper on it's sort of connected to questions like ecological validity of experiments. And so the kind of classical paradigm is to you have a very controlled lab environment, and then you have a lot of subjects. Yeah, but actually, you want to have validity. You want to be kind of running the experiment in lots of different environments. Yeah, because if you're only running in one sort of environment, then you're going to have these sort of problems with ecological validity. And so in particular, if you're living, if the sort of task is one in which you've got a lot of non-linearity of the environment, like it, then you're going to have, then lab experiments are just going to not fail, are going to fail to replicate because of slight setups in the environment. So the sort of worry is lab experiments are just going to tell you what you're going to learn about the lab experiment is going to be the structure of the experimental design. Okay, so you get something that you can replicate because your experimental design is such that you cut down on so many variables that you don't get any. Yeah, but you go out and then it doesn't have generalizability. That's their sort of worry. Yeah, and then the question is well, I think they're a bit too kind of one-sided, because it seems to me that it may turn out there are certain things where you do have linearity, where you do have extrapolability. I've said you have extrapolation, and then you have extrapolatability. Extrapolatability. Yeah. So I think one question is this a sort of task where you have extrapolatability? And that's a question not about that's a question that's not about the organism. That's a question about the environment. Yeah. Is this the sort of task where you've got, and so this is the sort of question where and I think this is a very important question for psychology. Yeah, is asking, are we in a sort of area where we can expect extrapolatability? But you might think that, as you were saying about Gibson, maybe with the Gibsonian stuff, we might think there is going to be extrapolatability. And the stuff about including edges, so one thing Gibson thinks is that the lighting conditions can change rapidly, but the information in the light on a path about including edges is going to be quite robust. Yeah, so you might think that with our capacity to pick up on the structure of the layout of the environment, Gibsonian terms, you do have quite good extrapolability. Yeah, that works. Yeah. Okay, so let's have a break. We're a bit behind in the class. Now, and so I want to rush through, I want to finish the stuff on social cognition and concept by the break, and then read the stuff on Bayesianism and the predictive mind.
What do you mean by break? Yeah, basically second.
What?
No.
No. I mean, after the break for Byron.
Yeah.
Oh, you're panicking. It's like, oh my God. It's like, stop. He's gonna come up with it's gonna be Gibson until next week. Yeah. So next week, people who are interested in social cognition or concepts, any sort of, no, you don't, both are interested. Not so much. Okay. So I was thinking for next week that so we've got 2 more weeks until Climate, yeah? All right. 2 weeks or 3 weeks?
2 weeks. The
Okay, so next week, let's talk about sellers and the short Tomasello article. Yeah, so I think sellers, I like sellers, and you guys probably haven't read sellers. And Tomasello, if you're in philosophy, you probably haven't read it. If you're in psychology, you probably read some Tomasello. So, yeah, so if you read the Tomasello before, read the, if there's one of them you've already read, read the other one. And then the week after, we'll talk about Milligan, and maybe not, maybe we'll skip Kerry. I can say a little bit about Kerry as well. But read the Milligan paper. So next week, I'll send an email. But next week, let's do sellers and mob. And then the week after that, let's do Milligan. And yeah. And then if you're interested in concepts, Terry's quite fun. And I think Tomasello. Did you read Tomasello? Yeah. You read Sellers? Sellers is a philosopher, and he has this is for lectures he gave in the 50s. But if you're in psychology and you come across theory in the philosophy of mind, he's the sort of founder of theory. I mean, in this section of the lectures, he introduces this idea of the myth of Jones, where he comes up with the idea of belief attribution as an explicit theory. Then he talks about how it's a theory. So I think if you're in psychology, I think bringing a bit of philosophical background. And then he had some students. Denny was a student of Ryan. So his students were Paul Churchland, So eliminativism. So eliminativists buy into this sort of theory, because they're like, well, folk psychology, Stitch and Churchland have much the idea of folk psychology. And so folk psychology is a theory, it's just about it. Yeah. But Sellers is quite fun. He's yeah. Okay, sure. Bye-bye.